Can you be both Mexican and native? The short answer, yes. The longer answer is the subject of this video. According to recent data, about 21.5% of Mexico's population identifies as indigenous. This is about 25 million people, because Mexico's total population is about 120 million. Indigenous people have to fight for rights. Legal recognition is complicated. The Mexican Constitution recognizes the country as a multicultural nation, which provides a legal framework for the protection of indigenous rights. Laws like the General Law of Linguistic Rights of Indigenous Peoples aim to preserve and promote indigenous languages and cultures in the country. Indigenous communities have the right to self-determination and governance according to their traditional practices. This includes the ability to manage their own resources and maintain their legal and cultural institutions. Various initiatives support the preservation and promotion of indigenous cultures in Mexico. This includes funding for cultural projects, education in indigenous languages, and recognition of traditional knowledge and practices. And there are efforts to increase indigenous representation in political spheres. Indigenous leaders and organizations have been working to ensure that their communities' voices are heard at local, regional, and national levels. But there are still challenges. Indigenous communities in Mexico often face higher levels of poverty and limited access to economic opportunities. This economic disparity is linked to historical marginalization and ongoing discrimination. Many indigenous people experience difficulties accessing quality healthcare, education, and social services. Geographic isolation and language barriers further exacerbate these challenges. There are land disputes. There's an encroachment on large-scale agricultural mining and infrastructure projects on indigenous lands. These conflicts often result in displacement and environmental degradation. And there's discrimination. Indigenous people in Mexico frequently face social exclusion, manifesting in forms from everyday bias to systemic inequalities in justice and education systems. But let's back up a little bit. The intriguing question is, can Mexicans also be considered native? When we talk about identity, it's essential to understand that Mexican and native are two kind of distinct categories that can intersect in meaningful ways. First, let's define what we mean by Mexican. Mexican identity is often associated with nationality, tied to the country of Mexico. It encompasses an extremely diverse population, with a rich blend of cultural, ethnic, and historical backgrounds. This includes people of Spanish descent, Afro-Mexicans, indigenous peoples, and people who have some of all. On the other hand, native or indigenous usually refers to the quote-unquote original inhabitants of a region and their descendants who maintain cultural ties and traditions passed down through the generations. In Mexico, there are lots of indigenous groups: the Nahua, the Maya, the Zapotec, and many others. These groups have their own languages, customs, and histories that predate the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Now here's where it gets interesting. Many Mexicans today have indigenous ancestry. The Mexican government census, as I just said, shows that millions of people in Mexico identify as indigenous. This means that their heritage includes connections to one of the many indigenous cultures within the country. This is far more than we have in the United States. The diversity in skin tones among Mexicans is a reflection of the country's complex history. You might notice that Mexican people come in all sorts of different shades, but they all speak Spanish. So what is the diversity in skin tones? There's been a blending of various ethnic groups over the centuries in Mexico. The Spanish first arrived in the 16th century. They encountered a whole bunch of different indigenous civilizations. The subsequent colonization led to significant intermarriage between indigenous peoples and Spanish settlers. This resulted in a mixed-race population called the mestizos. Mestizaje, or the process of mixing, is a key aspect of Mexican identity. Over the centuries, Africans were brought to Mexico as well as part of the transatlantic slave trade, further contributing to the country's ethnic and genetic diversity. This blend of indigenous, European, and African ancestries has resulted in the wide range of skin tones seen in Mexico today. It's important to note that the diversity in appearance does not necessarily correlate with the amount of indigenous blood that a person has. Identity and culture in Mexico are complex and multifaceted, and people with varying appearances identify with and celebrate their indigenous heritage. Who gets to count as indigenous in Mexico? Determining who gets to count as indigenous in Mexico involves a lot of different criteria. Key factors include self-identification. The most important aspect of indigenous identity is sheer self-identification. Individuals who identify themselves as belonging to one of Mexico's numerous indigenous groups get to be considered indigenous. This self-identification must, however, be tied to a sense of community, cultural practices, and shared heritage. Perhaps the most important qualification is language. Speaking an indigenous language is a significant indicator of indigenous identity. Mexico recognizes 68 national languages, one of them is Spanish. The other 67 are indigenous languages. The ability to speak an indigenous language is often seen as a strong connection to indigenous culture and heritage. Community membership. Being part of an indigenous community is another key factor. These communities maintain distinct cultural practices, traditions, and social structures. Membership in these communities often involves participating in communal activities, ceremonies, and governance. Cultural practices. Traditional cultural practices like festivals, crafts, music, and rituals also contribute to indigenous identity. These practices help preserve the unique cultural heritage of each indigenous group. And then ancestry. Having indigenous ancestry is a very important factor, but it's not the sole determinant. Many people with mixed heritage may identify as mestizo, but still maintain strong connections to their indigenous roots. The Mexican government, through its various institutions, recognizes and supports the rights and identities of indigenous peoples. Census data also includes questions about indigenous identity, helping to provide a clearer picture of indigenous populations in the country. It's important to note that indigenous identity in Mexico is quite multifaceted, reflecting a blend of historical, cultural, and personal factors. The recognition and celebration of indigenous identities are crucial for preserving the rich cultural diversity that characterizes Mexico. Thank you so much for listening.